So you won't believe it. I came back from Austin, Texas really, really, really early this morning. In fact, I'm pretty tired. So if I look tired, you'll have to forgive me. I woke up at 3 in the morning LA time in order to catch my flight back to Los Angeles. And then, of course, there's always trouble at the airport and all that and whatnot. So kind of tired. But the weekend in Austin was... I am a little like shell shocked. I don't know how else to describe it. I have been living for nearly a year and a half under a pretty strict lockdown in Los Angeles, California, where we were told you had to stay away from one another. You couldn't go out to eat. You have to wear a mask even when you're outside walking your dog by yourself 50 feet away from the next person. You still need to wear a mask outside in Los Angeles. So we've been living under such strict lockdown that going someplace where everything was open, and I mean not just open, but I went to a bar when I first landed on Friday night, and the bar had a band playing. I mean, the horror, the shock and the horror for me. There would never be such a thing here in Los Angeles, and the band was playing, and there was crowds dancing around the band, and no one was wearing a mask. It was. Honestly, as much as I have been the person who is talking a lot about, these economic shutdowns aren't going to work when it comes to stopping the spread of COVID and whatnot, even though I have been very much against all those lockdowns, I was still very shocked. Not shocked like, oh my gosh, what are these people doing? They're insane, but just shocked like I've been living in a cave for the last year and a half. Now, Los Angeles has slowly started to open up, and according to the government, tomorrow we're back open. They're saying June 15th, we're back open. And we're going to drop all the mask mandates, although they're saying that's only for the vaccinated people. And of course, I live in Los Angeles, so there will be vaccine passports where I live, which will cause me to move out of I will not stay if that happens. It will be the straw that breaks the camel's back. I will have to leave. But, there was a long period of time where we couldn't even eat outside. I don't know if there was anywhere else in the country where they shut down outdoor dining, where you could be spaced apart, especially in a place like California where the weather's really nice. I understand, maybe in New York City, they might say, yeah, you can do outdoor dining if you want to in 0-degree snowy weather, but you wouldn't want to, so you wouldn't do it. But in Los Angeles, they completely shut that down. It wasn't even an option. And they barely just opened up outdoor dining only a couple of months ago. Indoor dining, we've started to slowly trickle that in. If you go into some restaurants, you can now sit down inside, but it's extremely limited in seating. And I guess as of tomorrow, supposedly we're supposed to be opening right back up. But in Texas, they've been open for a really, really long time. Florida, they were open since September. Idaho, where I'm from, they opened up really at around Christmas time. They were supposed to be closed down, but people weren't really following the guidelines. And I know that the bars were packed and there were bands playing, even at around New Year's in Idaho. So the rest of the country has been very open. It makes me realize how much of a sort of like a person who's, I don't know the right word for it, but I think I've come across over the last year and a half, but maybe more so in the last 6 months as like, a crazy person a little bit, especially on social media, where I'd be like, oh, these lockdowns, like, end these lockdowns. These are terrible. These are horrible. And I realize it's because I've been living under a really strict lockdown, but a lot of you haven't been actually. And maybe you think you have, there's a lot of people who still advocate for the lockdowns. They think that this was a really good idea. And so they say, well, we were really compliant in our area and we were great. And then I find out what their lockdown measures were compared to where I'm at. And I'm like, you didn't have a lockdown compared to what I've been dealing with in Los Angeles. That's not a lockdown. And the fact that it's so varied all across the country, the fact that some areas, their idea of harsh measures don't compare to other areas' ideas of harsh measures. What does that even say? I mean, when area by area, people could think that they were living under strict lockdowns, but they weren't actually in comparison to others. So, yeah, I know I must have sounded like a crazy person over these last little while, but look, I've been living under a pretty strict lockdown. Not only am I under Gavin Newsom, but I'm also under Mayor Villaraigosa, who also is very, 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 he's been very much a dictator on the lockdowns as well. And what's really crazy is that, you've got Orange County, California, just south of me. It's driving distance. People commute back and forth all the time. And Orange County is a more purple area politically. They're pretty mixed, 50-50 red and blue. And they took a much more measured approach to the lockdowns. They weren't doing what LA was doing, except when Gavin Newsom forced them into it. So when the state did the mandates, then everyone in the state had to do it. But when the state lifted the mandates, then the regional politicians in Orange County did not put forward the same stringent measures that our local government did here in Los Angeles. And, their outcome wasn't any worse than Los Angeles. In fact, I think Orange County did a little better than Los Angeles. And a lot of areas in the country did better than Los Angeles. And when the news was freaking out about Florida back in September, when Ron DeSantis lifted all the measures, people said, oh my gosh, this is a giant mistake. He's going to live to regret this. And, nothing really happened. Same thing with Texas. Same thing with a lot of these real conservative states that lifted up the mandates early on. We didn't see all of the tragedy that they told us we would see. We saw the same tragedy really everywhere. Los Angeles, we ended up at 0% availability for ICU beds. And it was mayhem for a while at those hospitals. They did not have enough beds. And yet here we were living under the strictest lockdown, strictest mask mandates in the country for the longest time. You couldn't even use the excuse of, well, we were just too late. We started the measures too late. No, we were the first and we're the last to get out of them. So this weekend was crazy. I went to Austin and I went to these bars and I went to these restaurants, and the restaurants had every table full and the bars were packed and people were dancing together. And I went to a wedding. That's why I went there. And the wedding was packed and we were all crammed together and everybody was dancing. It was amazing. It was amazing to see people really, truly go back to normal. Now, we did have to wear our masks here and there. Like if you're taking an Uber ride, you have to wear your mask. Going inside of stores, you need to wear a mask. But it was really 50-50 on who adhered to those mask mandates in Texas. It wasn't everybody. So we did because, for one, we're used to it living in Los Angeles, living under these mandates. It's like, just wear a mask. It's not a big deal. And I think it's a matter of courtesy personally, whether you think they work or not. It's, it's like, well, it's more of a politeness, so if they work, then they work, and that's a good thing. And if they don't, then I guess it's polite in order to help somebody else feel like maybe you're doing something to protect them, I suppose. So crazy, seeing all of that. More craziness happened while I was in Austin, Texas, and that was a shooting happened at a bar on 6th Street in Austin. Right when I was walking nearby that bar, actually, I was only 3 blocks away at the time that it happened. And then suddenly the sirens went off and we were kind of looking down the street thinking, wow, somebody must have gotten way too drunk tonight, not realizing what had actually happened at that bar. So waking up the next morning, we find out that there was this shooting at a bar. I think it was called the Jackalope in Austin. So it's kind of I don't know what kind of a bar it is, but I've never been there. When I lived in Austin, I don't even know if that bar existed, or if it did, I never went. And it's right in the middle of this area. If you've never been to Austin, Texas, it's a lot like New Orleans, where there's just miles of bars, and it's bar after bar after bar after bar after bar, and they block off that road, 6th Street, on Fridays and Saturday nights, and you can't drive down that road because there's just people swarming the streets like Mardi Gras every weekend in Austin. It's a party town. I had a lot of fun living there for the 5 years that I did, but it was time to leave. So there was a shooting at this bar. Woke up the next morning to find out about this. Also hearing reports of a shooting in Savannah, Georgia, and also in Chicago. And they were saying, this is the 5-year anniversary of the Pulse nightclub shooting. And we wake up to these mass shootings in these places. And I want to do some clarification on that a little bit, because I think when many of us think of a mass shooting, at least for me, I think of a person going into a place, a facility, and shooting at the people, right? So going into a school or a theater or a grocery store or a bar or wherever, and you're just shooting, and you're just, whoever you hit, you're there trying to hurt and kill as many people as you can. And maybe there's a person you were sort of targeting, but you wanted the others as well. It wasn't just this one person you were going after and other people kind of got hit in the crossfire. It was, so that's kind of what I think of when I think of mass shooting. What happened over the weekend, none of those three were, by that definition, I would say mass shootings by that definition, where it is, you're in a public place minding your own business and then somebody comes in with a gun and starts shooting the place up. So in Austin, Texas, what had happened was, and there's 2 points that I'm going to make to this tonight. One is the definition of the mass shooting, and two, the implications of these shootings on gun control and how these shootings sort of changed my mind a little bit on some of the aspects when it comes to gun control. So the mass shooting aspect. In Austin, Texas, what had happened was 2 guys got into a fight at a bar. Both of them were carrying weapons, and they started shooting at each other, clearly with very bad aim, because they ended up hitting 14 people in the process. But they were going after one another. This was a bar fight gone way wrong. And I don't, it's one of those situations where I'm like, why don't we bring back the old-fashioned Western duel? Take it out back. If you want to draw your guns at each other, fine. But don't do it in a crowded bar where there's all of these people and 14 people end up getting shot. Thankfully, none of them died. I believe that in Chicago and in Savannah, it was similar situations where it was gang violence, I believe, in Savannah, where there were 2 gangs that were shooting at each other and people were hit in the crossfire, and extremely tragic. And I believe that the house where that exchange happened had already been hit a couple of nights prior, again, by the gang violence that was going on, but nobody in the community was willing to report it, willing to talk to the police. They weren't willing to give any information. They weren't willing to give any identities. It's the classic situation of gang violence that is happening in our inner cities, that is where the people are afraid to talk because they're going to be targeted by the gangs. They don't want to get law enforcement involved. And so that is what happened in Savannah. And I believe in Chicago, it was something very similar to that, where it was, again, sort of an isolated gang violent sort of event. Different than what I would consider a mass shooting when we think of mass shootings and the terrifying aspects of mass shootings. Another thing that I saw trending on social media was about the defunding the police was the reason why, this bar fight broke out in Austin and this shooting happened and 14 people were shot. It was because of defund the police. I could tell you there is no lack of police presence on Austin 6th Street on the weekends. It is the most heavily policed area in the country, I believe, at that moment, even more so than the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. There are cops everywhere on 6th Street at every single intersection. They block off that street. So every single intersection, there are loads of cop cars, not just one, not just two, but we're talking at every intersection, there's about 7 or 8 cop cars. And it's been like that for years. That's not new. That isn't something that has changed. And that is something that I witnessed while I was there. The cops were there. That had nothing to do with it. So thinking that this was a defund the police problem, that is not what happened in Austin, Texas. This was 2 people who got drunk and they happened to be carrying weapons and they decided to pull those weapons out and shoot at each other. So this takes me to the second thing that is kind of shifting my perspective a little bit when it comes to gun violence. And I know this is going to make a lot of people, those of you who are on the right, not so happy. All 3 incidences that happened over the weekend, the vast majority of the people that were shot survived. In Austin, Texas, all of them survived, all 14. In Savannah, I believe, all but 1. And same in Chicago. It was 1 or 2 fatalities. Everybody else who was shot survived. The reason was none of these incidences, as far as I can see in the news at this point, as far as the reports are, maybe things will change, but from what I'm hearing, these were pistols, handguns. These were not AR-15s or any other sort of semi-automatic rifle. They were semi-automatic pistols, but not because nobody uses a revolver anymore, unless you really are going to have an old-fashioned Western duel, I guess, and take it out back. So they're using semi-automatic pistols, but they're not using semi-automatic rifles. So that was more survivable for all of those people. And had a shooter gone in there, now, of course, this would have been in different circumstances. These two guys are concealed carrying, obviously, because they're going out, they're having a good time at the bars, the clubs, or wherever they're going. And then I believe, now I'm not 100% certain with the laws in Texas with the concealed carry, because I think they're shifting those laws. I know they're shifting the laws on permits, but I don't believe you're allowed to take a gun in where there's alcohol in Texas, but I could be wrong on that. But nonetheless, they then had the concealed carry weapons, and then they pulled them out and started shooting. Obviously, if somebody walked in that door with an AR-15, that would have been very different, and the fatalities would have been numerous. There wouldn't have been 14 survivors. That just wouldn't have likely happened with somebody coming in with something, with a weapon, a gun as powerful as a semi-automatic rifle. And the reason is because the speed at which those bullets come out of those rifles, when those bullets, the type of bullets they're using, when those bullets hit the body, what the bullet does, a 9mm, if you shoot at somebody, it's maybe going to go clean through them. It's going to be just a clean straight through shot, or the bullet hits and stops at the bone. It doesn't tumble through the person's body, causing all kinds of internal damage, causing them to not likely survive because it's torn through their insides. Like it hits the body and then it tumbles through it. So the damage is extensive with semi-automatic rifles. So that is something I think everybody should really keep in mind when we're talking about the gun control debate. And that is, these events were highly survivable because the people were using handguns and not rifles that they were able to just kind of carry on in, semi-automatic rifles. So obviously if a person came in with like a lever action rifle or a bolt action rifle, for those of you who don't know a lot about guns, semi-automatic just means you just pull the trigger, pull the trigger, pull the trigger, pull the trigger. A machine gun, a fully automatic weapon, is you just hold the trigger down and bullets spray. Those are illegal for the most part. You can get one if you have like special permits and you're a collector or a museum or something like this. But for the most part, normal average people like you and I cannot just go and buy a machine gun, a fully automatic rifle. Semi-automatic means if you pull the trigger, you pull the trigger, you pull the trigger, the bullets fly out of it. Bolt action or lever action means you have to actually have a motion in between each shot that's fired. So there's a bit of time there in between shots for maybe somebody to tackle you. Now the power of the rifle is the same as a semi-automatic rifle. What the bullets do is the same. And the speed is the same. It's just the number of bullets coming out of the weapon are different. And so it's more survivable even if you're sticking to bolt action and lever action rifles, which would be largely used in hunting. And that's what good hunters use when they hunt. Good hunters don't typically use semi-automatic rifles. I know I'm sure I'm offending some of you, but I'm an Idaho girl, and that is what, look like. Shooting, if you're just into going out there and shooting around and you like having fun and you're aiming at targets, that's one thing. But actually hunters would use other types of rifles and not semi-automatic weapons. It's not semi-automatic rifles if they're good at if they're good hunters. So I just think that this is something that we should have a discussion about or think again about after the events this weekend. And it certainly made me think. It certainly gave me room to pause and think more about it. I've always been, when I was younger, especially, not even that much younger, we're talking like 5 years ago, I believed that if the government can have the weapons, then the people should be able to have the weapons. A very radical viewpoint. I've definitely changed my mind on that one because I don't want billionaires like Bill Gates, for example, being able to just own a nuke because the government owns a nuke. Obviously, you and I would not be able to afford one, but a guy like Bill Gates could, and that is really scary. So that is not something that I believe, that if the government owns it, then the people should be able to own it. But fundamentally, the reason why I would have that view is because I do know, and I have personal family experience with this, as much as people here in the United States think naively, and I think it's very naive to think that you'll never have to battle your own government. That is a naive way of thinking. That is a privileged way of thinking of people who have never experienced a tyrannical government. And we're not above a tyrannical government. I think that we're seeing slowly or just a shifting of tyranny that goes on within our own government. And it could get worse. You never know. I certainly hope not. I hope that people are able to rein in on the government in other ways, but you never know. You just never know. And my own family, my grandmother, has had to outrun 3 tyrannical governments, or 3 governments that she didn't want to live under, starting with the North in North Vietnam, having to flee from the North to the South, and then having to flee the South after the American-Vietnam War ended. And then she went to Iran. And in 1978, there was a revolution in Iran, and she had to flee out of Iran. So my grandmother, who's still alive to this day, could tell you these stories. And she's a living, breathing person today. This is not somebody from some ancient history book, although my grandmother is kind of ancient. You know, she's in her 90s. But nonetheless, she's experienced these things where people, her neighbors, her sons, her husbands, had to turn against their own government and fight. And so in my mind, that has never been an unrealistic prospect. Of course, you might have to, at some point, fight your government. You never know. I mean, certainly our founding fathers understood that principle. So that mentality of, well, we'll never have to do that, and if we did, we would lose. There's no way we would win. That is such a naive, narrow-minded mentality. The Vietnamese, my family members even, some of my family members fought for the North. Some of my family members fought for the South. They were very ill-equipped against the French the first time around and against the Americans the second time around. And yet were able to defeat both powerful militaries. And using guerrilla warfare, not having the same tactics, not having the same training, not having the same weapons, not having any of that. And the Vietnamese people were able to overthrow these empires who were marching on in. And so to think, oh, well, if it ever happened to us, it's naive. And so we don't need weapons. You know, this is the argument I always hear where, oh, we don't need weapons because, look, if you ever had to rise up against the government, you'd get crushed in a minute. That's not true. That is not true. It is not in the U.S. government's best interest, if there were something like that were to happen, to nuke its people. So this kind of idea that they would just carpet bomb citizens in the United States and that everything would go back to normal. Could you imagine? Could you imagine if the U.S. government just decided to carpet bomb Dallas, Texas? How well do you think that would go with the rest of America? Do you think the rest of America would say, ooh, they got what they deserved. They rose up. They tried to fight their government. And look what happened to them. So you know what? Let's all just fall back in line. No, that would make things worse. Governments know that. Militaries know that. They don't do that. That's not a tactic they employ. So this notion that we would never need weapons in order to fight against our government, I don't buy that. I don't agree with that. I do think it's an absolute possibility. Could happen in our lifetime. I don't know. And I try to remain prepared. But at the same time, we do have this issue in our society where there's a lot of weapons that are getting into the hands of people who absolutely should not have those weapons. And I know that there's always going to be criminals who end up with weapons, and that is a big problem. You don't want to end up, you know, where the criminals have all the powerful weapons and you don't. So I fully understand. Believe me, I am sympathetic to the arguments because I agree with them, a lot of them. But after this weekend and just seeing these 3 shootings and seeing that all 3 of them were with handguns, and that is why the vast majority of the people survived, it does kind of make me pause a bit. So maybe there's some solution there. Maybe there's more discussion that could be had there when it comes to how we can sort of regulate a bit better. But that is just something I was thinking about after my trip to Austin this weekend. So we did have another scare the next day. It was very scary. So we found out the next morning, Saturday morning, that the sirens and everything we saw from the night before were because of the shooting at the bar. And we went back to we went out for barbecue that morning, and that's where we found out about it when we were meeting up with people, and they told us, oh, you know. And then we went back to the hotel, and suddenly I get this notification on my phone that is kind of an alert for any nearby incidences, and it's a citizen app, and it tells me that there was a shooting in my hotel while I was there. 2 floors above my floor. So I immediately make sure I lock the doors, and I'm like, oh my gosh, there's possibly a shooter in the hotel. This is a very scary moment. I don't know what's going on. It did say it was unconfirmed reports of a shooting in my hotel on the 8th floor, and I was on the 6th floor. So waited a little bit, waited for more reports to come out, didn't hear any sirens, didn't hear any more reports. So I called the front desk and said, this is an alert that came up on my phone. And they said, oh, no, ma'am. The police are here on site investigating, but it was somebody broke a window. So because the windows are really thick at the hotel, I guess it sounds like, maybe a gunshot or something. And maybe it was, I don't know. But they just said it was a broken window, that somehow a window. So that was that. And that was very scary to have happen on the same day that this shooting, that we found out about the shooting. And some of you know we went to Mexico only a few weeks ago. And actually getting my boyfriend to Mexico was a little bit tough because he was kind of like, I don't know. And a lot of you guys were also like, Kim, don't go to Mexico. What are you doing? Don't go to Mexico. It's really scary down there. It's dangerous. But I go and I love Mexico. And yes, I understand you have to be safe and there's areas you have to avoid. But he was in Austin. He'd never been to Austin. I was taking him there for this wedding. And he was like, oh my gosh, we were safer in Mexico than we were in Texas. This is the wild, wild west. So that's, I guess maybe it is the wild, wild west in Texas. I don't know. But it was definitely a wild weekend on a lot of fronts, from the bars, the clubs, the bands, the maskless people, the crowds, everything being wide open, no restrictions really at all, to wild shootouts at bars, like saloons and all of that. So love to hear from you. Love to hear your thoughts on my take on all of this, kind of my takeaway. What do you think? Please go ahead and email me, kim@kimiverson.com, to share with me your thoughts and what you think the solution could be going forward. So kim@kimiverson.com. Also, you can join my locals community. There, when you join my locals community, you actually receive a lot of these postings. It's sort of like social media mixed with behind the scenes content, casual content, mixed with exclusive videos, exclusive show segments that I'm not able to post on YouTube. And we're going to get into that as to why I cannot post a lot of things on YouTube. But join my locals community. It is $5 a month, or you could just follow me. I do some free posts, but a lot of the good stuff is for those who do support the show with $5 a month. And there you're going to get all of this great content. Trust me, it's pictures, videos, extra segments, and there's a lot more of these extra segments coming out because the censorship is getting really, really intense on YouTube. So let's talk about that censorship that is going on YouTube. You guys all know Bret Weinstein. So he was censored recently. He's been doing a lot of videos regarding the pandemic. I'm going to be very careful with the words that I use because I don't want to get another strike on my channel and end up being banned, which is happening seemingly left and right to a lot of different people right now and has been for a while, and it's only seeming to ramp up. But Bret Weinstein is a PhD in biology. He interviews people who are also credible scientists and doctors on his channel, talking about the pandemic, talking about the vaccine rollouts, and a variety of other things surrounding the pandemic. And a lot of his stuff is, I would say, counter to the mainstream narrative, counter to what's on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, counter to what other people on YouTube are saying, the trendy narrative of what we must do. I think Bret Weinstein gives a really good counter to all of that using science and facts and experts. So he recently had a doctor on his show, Dr. Pierre Corey. You might have heard of him. He is an advocate of treatments for COVID-19. He has even really been on the forefront of some of the existing protocols for existing COVID-19 patients. So he is absolutely an expert in the field. He is a frontline doctor working with these patients every single day and even writing up the protocols for how to best treat them that are being used across the country in various hospitals. And he is an advocate of some other treatments that are not allowed to be used in the United States and in other places. And Brett Weinstein did a video about one of these in particular, alternative treatments. Now, I myself also did a video on this alternative treatment. I did not post it on YouTube. That is for you to watch on Locals or Rockfin. You can see that video there. And the reason I didn't post it on YouTube was because I knew that it would be censored. Now, some people said to me, oh, but Kim, lots of people are talking about this Kim Ivor drug. Speaking in code, guys, speaking in code. And they said, everybody's talking about it now on YouTube. And so it's okay. You're not going to be censored if you talk about it. Well, this weekend proved that is not the case. And the one thing that I said to people was, no, they're risking it. If they're talking about it, yes, their video might be up. Yes, you might be seeing it. But at some point, the overlords are going to come along and they're going to remove the video and they're going to strike the channel down. So these people are risking it when they do this. And I chose not to risk it. So I placed that video. It's about a half an hour long. Definitely go check it out. It's in my Locals community or on Rockfin. And you can watch that exclusive video. And I do have more coming through the pipeline that are exclusive and will not be on YouTube. And Brett Weinstein was one of those who decided to risk it. And he posted this video and he gave all of his qualifications as a scientist. He gave all of Dr. Pierre Corey's qualifications as a medical doctor and scientist and researcher. And nonetheless, the YouTube community decided it went against their community guidelines for spreading medical misinformation. And they removed the video a day or two ago. So, and now he has a warning on his channel. And I'm sure that he may receive more from more content that is on his channel that they deem inappropriate or they're calling medical misinformation, even though there is plenty of medical science backing up what they're saying. And even if you don't agree with it, the discussion should be allowed, right? Also, Senator Ron Johnson also had his channel banned over the weekend. He is no longer allowed to post for the same thing, talking about a treatment that is apparently controversial, even though all the science is positive regarding it. There's actually no negative science regarding it. Actual science, actual scientific research papers. Nothing is actually showing anything negative. So that's the most bizarre part about all of this. And his channel was also removed. He received a strike and cannot post anything for a week. Over the weekend, I also myself received from Facebook some warnings that my page had violated medical misinformation and community guidelines for Facebook. I received 3 warnings on my Facebook page. They haven't really done anything that I can tell to the page, but people that read the post decided to flag my page and are attempting to get my page removed on Facebook. And it's probably a matter of time that it does get removed. I would assume, I don't make money off of Facebook or anything like that, so it's no skin off my back, but it's alarming and it's bothersome to me. Not because, the money issue isn't, the censorship is the issue. The fact that we can't have conversation, we can't post, we can't give information and even back that information up with other news articles from news outlets or scientific research papers or opinions from actual scientific medical experts. None of that is allowed. And it should leave every single person to wonder, even if you agree with the mainstream narrative of what the protocol should be, even if you're like, nope, this is what we have to do. Everybody needs to lock down, stay away, mask up, vaccinate, even vaccinate your young kids. Even if you're on that side of it, you should still be open for hearing other opinions, especially from science. So when people like me who report on the science even, the people say, well, Kim, you're not a scientist, you're not a researcher. Well, no. How many people do you know read actual published research papers? I don't know of anybody who in their spare time does that. So what do? I read those research papers and I report on them to you. That is what reporting is. That's what news is. That's what CNN does. That's what MSNBC does. They're no different. That is what they're doing. They're taking this information that is being published and then they're reporting on it. And that reporting is also extremely important. And it shouldn't only come from medical doctors. Medical doctors are not reporters. That's not their job. Their job is to write up these medical pieces, publish them, and then reporters deliver the news to everybody and say, hey, this is what was recently published. But now in today's world, this is not allowed. This is, we've marched towards a one narrative nation, and we're not allowing ourselves the ability to have conversation and even disagreement with one another in regards to a variety of things that are actually happening, not just in regards to the pandemic, but other things as well. And so, receiving these flags on my page over the weekend, hearing that Brett Weinstein had his video with Dr. Pierre Corey removed, seeing that Ron Johnson had his channel, he got a strike and he's now banned from posting or uploading for a while. All of this should be the number one news story. The censorship should be the number one news story, because it is, I don't know where this leads us as a society. I really don't. And it's very, very scary. It's beyond frightening. It's beyond frightening that this is what we are marching ourselves towards, this one narrative nation. I will say, a year ago, I received a similar strike. People were flagging my page for misinformation, and Facebook did remove a video, and they even for a period of time locked me out of the page. I wasn't allowed to post for a period of time, and they flagged my posts as, they flagged all of them before they started. They now flag, I think, most COVID posts, but they started flagging mine in particular, saying that, learn the facts, go here instead of listening to this person. And the thing that they got me for, what they were flagging me for, what people were raising the alarm for and reporting my page for, was the reporting I was doing. I wasn't making the claim myself, but I was making the reports about how there were people who believed the virus came from a lab. That was deemed medical misinformation. Now here we are, a year later, and Biden is talking about that at the G7 summit. Talking about how we got to go after China for, covering up the real true origins of COVID-19. Now, this is a normal main Democratic talking point from people on the left and people all over Facebook and YouTube and the mainstream news. But in the process, what they do is they shut down all of these people, rip away our livelihoods, tell us that we're not allowed to report unless we report only what they want, when they want. And then if they change a year later and they get on board with what you were talking about, then, maybe you could come back and start back up, as if you could. We see how hard that is for businesses during a pandemic to shut down and then come back. It's nearly impossible to do that. So when you shut down these voices, when you remove them and then say, go ahead, come back. Look at what happened to Parler. Parler was a growing platform. Millions of people were using Parler. It was making news and everybody was going there. And then they shut it down. And they only needed to shut it down for a couple of months to do all the damage that they needed to do, because Parler came back and nobody goes on Parler, or at least very few, not as many people. I certainly don't go on Parler like I was. I was reading and seeing what was going on Parler before, and now I never check it. So they know if they just remove you, if they just silence you, even just for a couple of months, you can't come back. We see that with all the mom and pop shops that got shut down during the pandemic. And now Amazon, Jeff Bezos is rolling in even more dough. Walmart rolling in even more dough. All of these billionaires making more billions of dollars while mom and pop shops went under and they're not able to revive. So the same thing goes for these independent media channels. If they can silence us for even a week, they know that they do a lot of damage to us. And then when they shadow ban us, which they do, I know I've been completely shadow banned on this channel. So I'm trying to figure out a way to start a second one that is free of the algorithms, that doesn't, so I can post and hopefully things can actually start trending again and actually go viral again. And they just haven't been allowed to for over a year now. Actually, the last one they allowed to go viral was the one about the lab leak theory, and then they flagged it after it hit over 1 million. It had like 1.3 million views, and then they were like, we got to shut this person down. And then that's when after that is when my channel was completely flagged and limited, and I wasn't allowed to really grow. They wouldn't allow me any subscribers, and all of these things that they do to limit us, stop us from growing. And they do a really good job of that And then the only voices you're allowed to hear, even in the independent media space, are not really truly all that independent. They're still following the guidelines from the powers that be. They're told what they can and cannot say, and they follow those. And that is true of some of the biggest creators here on YouTube. They follow the guidelines that YouTube tells them because they get a community support advisor, and that community support advisor tells them these are the types of things that are going to get you banned from the platform. We're going to get you striked. We're going to get the algorithm against you. And those of us that don't have that person, we're speaking the truth. And what does it get us? It gets us nothing. It really doesn't get us anything. So the censorship is still there. It is still very real. Definitely something that, I will continue to report on and keep you up to date on, because if we just stop talking about all the censorship, they win. Because not only do they get to censor, but then no one talks about the censorship. So then they win. And we can't allow that to happen. So please, once again, follow me on Locals. Join me there. That is how you could best support the show financially. That is also how you could support the show and gain extra content. That is where you will receive more of these videos that are being silenced and censored, that I'm not able to post without fear of being shut down. So join my Locals community. That is where you can support the show. I really appreciate it. And you'll get a lot of great extra stuff there as well. All right, let's talk about Joe Biden and the G7 summit. Joe Biden was kind of an embarrassment to all of us. He had a lot of gaffes. Let's actually take a look at this video I put together for you. This is like a few of the different gaffes that Joe Biden had while he was at G7. I mean, his mind, it feels a little like it's definitely starting to go the way of slipping. So check this out.
Where we could work together with Russia. For example, in Libya, we should be opening up the passes to be able to go through and provide food assistance and vital assistance to a population that's in real trouble. I think I'm going to try very much hard to. It is. And by the way, there's places where. I shouldn't be starting off and negotiating in public here, but let me say it this way. Russia has engaged in activities which we believe are contrary to international norms, but they have also bitten off some real problems they're going to have trouble chewing on. And for example, the rebuilding of Syria, of Libya, they're there.
So just so you guys know, he keeps saying Libya, and he means Syria. So he keeps saying Libya. He's fumbling through his words. He's not making a lot of sense, and that is kind of what this gaffe is about. This first one.
And as long as they're there without the ability to bring about some order in the region, and you can't do that very well without providing for the basic economic needs of people. So I'm hopeful that we can find an accommodation where we can save the lives of people for example, in Libya. Answer the first question.
Okay, so the second clip is a reporter asks Joe Biden if he thinks Putin is a killer. So he says, you once said Putin is a killer, so what do you now think of that? And then he asks him a subsequent question, but Joe Biden is going to answer this, is Putin a killer question.
I'm laughing too.
See if you can make sense of it.
Well, look, I mean, he has made clear.
Nobody was laughing, by the way.
The answer is, I believe he has in the past essentially acknowledged that he was, there are certain things that he would do or did do. But look, when I was asked that question on air, I answered it honestly. But it's not much of a, I don't think it matters a whole lot in terms of this next meeting we're about to have. The second question was.
Yeah, so that basically made no sense whatsoever. That was, he made no sense at all with his answer on that. So, but he's trying to answer that question. It was clearly a gaffe. Nobody really knew what he was trying to say. This last little bit here is these reporters are trying to ask Joe Biden some questions. And clearly, the White House, they do not want Joe Biden talking off the cuff to anyone. So they shoo away all of the reporters, not allowing any of them to ask our president any questions.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Let's go.
Mr. President, can you tell us what you guys talked about?
You had a very good meeting.
You want the F-35 program back. Mr. President, can you tell us what you guys discussed? We couldn't hear you, sir.
I didn't say anything.
Thank you, guys. Let's go. Come on, let's go. Thank you, guys. Let's go. Come on, thank you. Let's go. Come on, thank you, guys. Come on, you guys. Why is anyone moving? Let's go. Come on, thank you. Let's go. You guys, let's go. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Watch them all, boss.
Watch them all, boss.
Why do they think they can get away with that?
We could work
Right?
together.
Why do they think they can get away with?
example,
Sorry, hold on. Let's stop that.
for example,
Why do they think that they can get away with shooing away reporters and saying things like, "Oh, we couldn't hear you. We couldn't hear you when we were asking." Why do they think they can get away with that? These are people that work for us. This is our government. They're not monarchy. They're not. This isn't supposed to be we're living under some authoritative dictatorship, and they have all the power and all the money, even though that is the way it is. That is the way it is. But it's not supposed to be this way. They're not supposed to be a monarchy, kings over us, peasants ruling us, and we're not allowed to ask them questions or wonder what they talked about on our dime at these meetings. So that is completely unacceptable, first of all. Now let's talk about what they talked about at this G7 summit. The agenda for the G7 was to talk about the pandemic and to talk about climate change. That was the official agenda. Now, the G7, the countries are, let's see if I can rattle these off. So you got the United States, the UK, Japan, France, Germany, Canada, and Italy? Is Italy the seventh country in that? So Germany, France, the UK, the US, Canada, Japan, must be Germany. Must be Italy, I believe. And then there are some that were invited guests. There was Australia that was invited. India was invited to the G7 summit. So was, I want to say, South Africa was invited, and South Korea. They were all invited to the G7 summit, but they're not part of the G7 now. It used to be G8 for a little while. They'd invited Russia. Remember, that was like a big scandal. So these 7 countries got together, and they were supposed to talk about the pandemic, and they were supposed to talk about climate change. They didn't really talk much about those. With climate change, they said that they're going to cut the carbon emissions. Their goal is to cut it in half by 2030. They did not come up with any sort of strategy when it comes to coal and when they would get off coal. So that by itself, if you are someone who voted for Joe Biden and you were absolutely anti-Trump because you believed the climate was a crisis, that the climate was the number one most important reason why you needed to vote Trump out of office, Joe Biden has been a disappointment to you. And it turns out that once he was in office, suddenly the climate catastrophe that was absolutely an existential crisis that needed to be addressed immediately has really been tabled. So again, it just goes to show that these political narratives, these what the campaigning that they try to get you, they fear you into believing that you must vote for them or else doom. And the Republicans do this too. They say, vote for us or communism. And it's all a bunch of crap, okay? We're not going to march in communism into this country. We'd have a lot of steps to go to reach before we ever got to that point. That's not going to happen. And Joe Biden doesn't care about the climate, really. So that, these are the types of things they just use in order to get us to vote based on fear and crisis. And it works every single time, which is why they continue to do this to us. So then they talked about the pandemic, and at the summit, these wealthy countries that make up the majority of wealth in the world said that they would agree to donate 1 billion vaccines to the world. So we're a world of nearly 8 billion people, but they're going to give generously 1 billion. So that should give you pause right there when it comes to ending the pandemic. If they really believed that these vaccines were the absolute golden ticket to ending the pandemic and that everybody needed to be vaccinated in order to end the pandemic, then we wouldn't be giving the vaccines away. We'd be giving the technology away so that the countries could develop their own vaccines, which many of them have the capacity to do, or at least they're near another country who could do it, and they could mass produce the vaccines and get them out to all of the poor people around the world, all the billions upon billions of poor people in the world. But instead, the United States, rather than saying to these big pharma companies, you have to release these patents, we're not going to let you hold on to them. This is a global pandemic, and this is for the benefit of the world, and you cannot harbor these to make money off of a crisis like this. If that were true, the United States government would force them to release the patents. But instead, what does the U.S. government do? Oh, no, the U.S. government forces you and I to buy those vaccines from Big Pharma, so tax dollars. They're not really donating these billions. The U.S. is donating them. Big Pharma's not. The U.S. has to buy those vaccines from Big Pharma. That's you and me buying them so that we could then give them to 1 billion people around the world. And the U.S. is committed to half of those. So we're going to spend our tax dollars on 500 million of these vaccines in order to give them to countries that need them the most, rather than forcing Big Pharma to actually donate these vaccines or donate the technology for the vaccines. How insane is that? That just goes to show this is more about Big Pharma making money. This has always been about Big Pharma making money. This isn't about ending the global pandemic. This isn't about the pandemic and stopping it from spreading or mutating. You know, the mutations, where were they coming from? They weren't coming from the United States because people were anti-vaxxers. They were coming from places like India, other places where people don't have access to the vaccines, right? And we could get into a big discussion about that, but I don't want to. So let's just stick with kind of the more of the narrative and then try to make sense of that narrative. And if the narrative is everybody in the world needs to be vaccinated in order to stop the pandemic, then why wouldn't we force these big pharma companies into giving the technology rather than forcing taxpayers to buy them off and ship them out? And we can't even ship that many. So we're still going to have these circulating viruses and new variants and whatnot. So then let's talk about what was really on Joe Biden's agenda when it comes to the G7 summit. And that was continuing to warmonger. This was a summit to warmonger Russia and warmonger China. And the good news is the European countries weren't really having it. They were kind of like, we don't want to go down that adversarial road that you, Joe, want to go down, that you warmongering Americans who love to build up your military industrial complex, because that has been a huge moneymaker for you. And remember, for Europe, not as much. And so they're saying, we're not really interested in this whole bullying China and Russia to make them totally adversarial. So Joe Biden says that the most important thing is we need to counter China, that it is important for the US, for the European allies and the United States to get together and hold China accountable. That was a big theme of the G7 summit. Same thing with Russia. Hold Putin accountable. What does that mean exactly? Don't really fully know. The European countries don't really fully know either what that means, although we all have pretty good guess, and that is just to march us into another Cold War that lasts probably decades, that ultimately harms a lot of people, that is not really very good for the world or very good for progress, and just continues potentially war, or at least the threat of war, which is good for the military-industrial complex because you always have to be prepared. So the European countries basically said, we're not really interested in that. We want to make it really clear that we don't want to be adversarial to Russia and China. Yes, we want them to adhere to certain standards when it comes to human rights, but at the same time, we want to make sure that they understand that we are partners. So that was the message coming out of Europe. They said, but we're partners. We're trade partners. We want to be partners in the climate. We want to be partners in economy and growth and all of these things. So Joe Biden goes out there and he says, no, we've got to hold China accountable for Hong Kong, for the Uyghurs, and for the lab leak, possibly of COVID-19. Where did it really come from, China? This is what Joe Biden's whole narrative is. And all of this is, when it comes to bullying China and bullying Russia really is, it's all in the same vein. And it is to prevent these countries from seeping into the U.S.'s interests. And when I mean interests, I mean monetary interests. So Russia is strategically placed in the world, right? Because it is partially in Europe, partially in Asia. And so it's really easy to do business with Russia as Russia continues to grow and develop. And, their people are doing really, really well. People in Russia are loving Russia now. Before they didn't. It wasn't very fun to live there. They didn't have many resources or access to things. And now they're living a pretty good life. And so the Russians are many of them are pretty happy in Moscow anyway. And the rest of the country is trying to develop. And so Russia, being so close in proximity to the rest of Asia and Europe, is in a really good position to provide resources and do trade and build up with that trade. We saw what happened with China when China opened up 30 years ago or 40 years ago. Suddenly, China was able to, with trade, grow and become stronger and more powerful and wealthier. And that is going to happen for Russia as well, as Russia kind of ends its aggression towards Europe, which it's done, and starts to say, hey, we want to be partners. We want to be viewed as European. They certainly seem and act in a lot of ways European. They share a lot of the same culture, a lot of the same religion. And so it makes sense that through time, when people forget about all of the USSR, Cold War stuff, that there will be more trade done with Russia and Europe, and Russia will become wealthier because of it. And when Russia becomes wealthier, then they become more threatening to the U.S. and the U.S.'s power. And that's obviously what's already happened with China. China has grown so much that it is now inevitable that China is the next world power. So at best, we can share, but we're not going to remain the sole world power. And I think that's pretty obvious to most people. So our government, what they do is they try to limit China's rise by making it an issue of morality. They don't want to make it an issue of competition. They don't want to say, hey, China's rising really fast. China's doing really well. What can we do to compete? How do we compete with them? Rather than actually coming up with strategies to compete with China or strategies to compete with Russia in order to play fair in a fair game, they instead decide to bully China, dehumanize China, and make it a moral issue, an issue of morality, in order to get not only the U.S. to gang up on China, but much of the West as well. And that's the strategy. And it's a horrible strategy. And it's not really Joe Biden's fault. I mean, this is something that has been built up for years, decades even. We knew China was on the rise for decades, and it was just ignored. People just really enjoyed shopping at Walmart and getting their cheap stuff. Politicians really enjoyed that their constituents could enjoy cheap products because we were getting cheap stuff from China. So nobody ever really questioned it. Nobody ever really wanted to do anything about it to counter it. And we just let it slip away. And it's been a discussion for a long time, for decades, that China would eventually rise up and potentially rival us as a world power. And that day is here. And now we're like, oh, crap, we didn't do anything to counter this. We weren't prepared. We didn't think ahead. China was thinking 100 years ahead. And here we were, we couldn't even think 2 years ahead of ourselves because we're constantly thinking of the next election cycle. So now we're here. Now China is obviously on the rise, and we are unprepared. And our only weapon is weapons. Our only weapon is war. And so you got Joe Biden going to G7, and he is doing what he can to make the issue with China a morality problem, and that everybody in the world must get together and hold China accountable for its human rights abuses. And that is just not going to work. I don't believe that is going to work for a very long time. And it's obvious it's not going to work because the Europeans roundly rejected that during this summit. They said, yeah, Joe, we'll kind of throw you a bone by saying, yeah, hey, China, knock it off. But hey, China, by the way, we're still friends. We're still friends. We're still trade partners. We're not really truly condemning you. That's just Joe's thing. That's just the U.S. The rest of us want to be friends. So the strategy isn't going to work. And it's just going to, but what will work is this will be fodder for the news on both sides. Both Republicans and Democrats hate China. Remember when it was Trump and it was Republicans, when you were a Democrat, you weren't allowed to hate China. You had to love China. But now that Joe Biden is in office and he's saying, no, China, now Democrats are hating China and Republicans hate China. So everybody's hating China. And that is what they want. What they want is everybody to hate China, because then it's a Cold War. Because then everybody in America is united against China, and they can rally everybody in patriotism against China. And we could build up and say China's a real threat. We got to build more nukes and build more bases and invade areas or sabotage their Belt and Road Initiative through various means of destabilizing regions. We love to destabilize regions. We do that. We know it works. We know that does limit powers from building. And I believe, have been doing that to China's Belt and Road for a while. When you look at all the ports, where they're going, and how suddenly some kind of strange terrorist attack happens, or terrorists have taken over the port, or terrorists blew up the port, or mysterious explosions happen. It's not all that mysterious when it keeps happening, and it keeps happening at ports, and ports where China wants to build its Belt and Road. So get ready. We're going into another Cold War. Don't buy it. Don't buy into any of it. Now, this does not mean that Putin is innocent and he's not a dictator. And it does not mean that China is free and clear of any human rights abuses. It doesn't mean any of that. The United States is not free and clear of human rights abuses. And the United States even props up dictators. I mean, look at what we were doing with Israel for the longest time and Netanyahu. Why did nobody question Netanyahu's lengthy reign as prime minister of Israel? But Putin, he goes for 12 years or so and goes for more. And he's trying to be dictator for life, right? Xi Jinping doesn't. He's dictator for life, but Netanyahu does it. And it's okay. No problem, right? Same thing with at the G7 summit. There was a little bit of a tension between Canada and the UK when Justin Trudeau Emmanuel Macron. It was France. There was a bit of beef between the French and the British, of course. And Emmanuel Macron sort of alluded to Northern Ireland not really being part of the UK. And that caused some tension. There was a lot of news written about it saying, oh, this is insulting. How insulting is it for the French to indicate that Northern Ireland isn't actually a part of the UK? Now, there's kind of a separatist movement a little bit going on in Northern Ireland, but that is no different than China saying we are offended that you're not recognizing Taiwan as part of China. You see the hypocrisy here? You see the hypocrisy? China believes Taiwan belongs to China. They believe that they are a one China nation. There was a war and the defectors ran off to the island, and they're saying, no, you lost. You are still part of China now. That is China's story. Northern Ireland has its own story. And apparently it's offensive to both countries, the UK or China, if the people in those little enclaves believe that they're not actually a part of those nations. And we criticize China for that, but it happens to Boris Johnson, and silence, total silence. We allow the UK to say, you're part of us. You're not separate. You're ours. A lot of hypocrisy, So, don't fall for it. Don't fall for it. We do not need to get involved in other countries' business. Other countries, we do not want them involved in our business. We don't have countries coming to invade us because they saw what happened in the summer of 2020 when all of these people were out in the streets saying that they'd had enough, that the police brutality was terrible, and that people were living under oppression in the United States. You did not see foreign militaries coming in to rescue us. You did not see foreign governments meddling with our internal politics. And we don't need to be meddling with others' internal politics. We wouldn't like it done to us. We shouldn't be doing it to anyone else. It doesn't mean that these countries don't have problems. It doesn't mean that their governments aren't committing abuses. I'm sure they are. All governments do. But what it does mean is we do not need to fall into the narrative that keeps us trapped in these war-mongering mentalities. All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate you guys sticking with me. I'm pretty tired. Like I said, I've been up since 3 o'clock in the morning, but powered through. Thank you guys so much for being here with me. Be sure to join my locals community. Again, you can go to my locals community, and there you can receive sort of like social media. I post kind of random behind-the-scenes stuff. You see pictures from when I was dressed up for the wedding last night. But also you get good content as well, segments that you don't receive on YouTube or even on Rockfin. You get segments there that are separate, some that are more casual, some that are fully produced, that are stuff that would be censored in other places. So be sure to join my locals community. Follow me there, and if you so choose, become a supporter, $5 a month, or you could do an annual, however you want to do it. I do absolutely rely on your support in order to keep this going. So thank you guys so very, very much. All right. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, you can also email me, kim@kimiverson.com. I do read all of your emails. I'm not able to respond to all of them, but I do read them. So keep them coming. A lot of you send me some really great information articles. Really, really appreciate it. All right, guys, have a great night. Thank you for watching.